We never know where life will lead us or what may hinder us along the way. But while every day can feel like one big question mark, it doesn't have to. With the right insights, strategies, and solutions from Western and Southern Financial Group, together we can look ahead to leave the unknown behind.
What's pro football focus doing? Last week they had Brady. This week they got Brady.
We're literally doing it differently from everybody else.
As a matter of fact, moving forward from this point on, I will not make reference to PFF.
Do you not understand that they are that way because you're Joe Flacco?
And you just like to discredit things that people deserve credit for.
That you can't possibly be expected to defend that.
Talk about the game, Sam.
So,
Who cares about what people think about us?
Yeah, I like football season, and all the things that go with
it. Welcome into the PFF NFL podcast. Steve Palazzolo back here with Sam Monson talking all things NFL. How you doing, man?
good, Steve. How about you?
Doing great. With my half Mark Brunell background. How's that look?
It looks terrible, but it looks
Nice.
better than what was there before you hit it with Mark Brunell. And is that Fred Taylor's ass that's going to be next to you for the entire show?
Unlikely. Fred Taylor was probably hurt that season. So
True. It does look like 28, though. That's Fred's number, right?
yeah, it's probably Fred. Might be Fred.
Okay.
Anyway, let's talk some NFL. Let's get right into it. First off, do you want to tell everybody about the little survey that we're doing? We're getting some feedback from all of our great listeners.
Yeah. We did this earlier, I think at the start of the offseason. Just a few short questions on a Google Forms to help us make the podcast better for you guys. So we've got some ideas of a couple of small changes, a couple of things that we want to do as we head into the NFL season. But let us know. Hashtag. Let us know what you would like, what you like about the show as it is, what you don't like, what we can do better. We have a Google Forms up there. I've tweeted it a couple of times, but we're going to set it as your pinned tweet. So at PFF_Steve, go there. It'll take 2 minutes of your time max. Let us know what we can do better and make this podcast as good as it can be.
Yeah, already seen some of the feedback, and it's we will take it all on board. Some interesting responses already from you guys, so really appreciate that. Also, don't forget, at pff.com, right now, 40% off. Save 40 is the promo code. Save 40. You get 40% off any first-time PFF subscribers. You'll get that 40% off on any of those PFF subscriptions. It's over at pff.com. It is the perfect time. Everybody's ramping up for fantasy, for betting, for simply being big-time fans of your team. So whether you're looking for premium stats, looking for our Green Line product, whatever it might be, it's all there, pff.com. Get that 40% off right now. And, as we always tell you, 365 days of access. So you're buying it now, and you're going to have it all the way through the draft and all the way through next, July 22nd, as we're recording here today. So be sure to do that. Save 40, save 40 for 40% off for first-time subscribers. All right, Sam, let's go ahead.
We've got a Bobby Wagner update. If you're expecting to hear Bobby Wagner on this show, it's probably not going to happen today on the basis that turns out he was on Chris's show.
Yeah, not happy about it.
Not
happy about it at all. How's Bobby going to back out on us twice and then show up at, let's just say, not the PFF NFL podcast?
Well,
right? Let's just say that.
I'm wondering whether he heard us, heard our displeasure at him bailing on us a couple of times and just went, what the hell with that? I'm going to go to the Big Cheese, go sit on his podcast. And
you know what it is? Bobby gets nervous in front of big crowds. I think that's what it is. He's a little nervous. He wanted to ease his way in on Chris's podcast, maybe work his way up to the PFF NFL podcast.
Yeah, so a couple of times, something's come up, can't do your show. He was just hanging around waiting until Chris extended the invitation. And then on he goes. Oh, yeah, I got a window on my schedule. Has now.
I mean, why don't you just go on public television or something?
You know what we need to do?
If you're afraid of the big crowd, afraid of the millions of listeners.
You know what we need to do? We need to get Fred Warner on. Throw our support around Fred as the best linebacker in the NFL.
The new highest paid linebacker. Can somebody get Fred Warner on the horn here? the new highest paid linebacker in the NFL. That's where we wanted to start. That's where we wanted to talk, Sam. 24-year-old former BYU linebacker, Fred Warner, now the highest paid linebacker in the NFL. There's a breakdown over at pff.com. And when we do those breakdowns, sometimes we tap into Mr. Brad Spielberger, our contract expert. There are some interesting numbers there showing essentially the discrepancies as linebackers have started to get paid more than safeties relative to each of those positions. Brad makes the point that both of those positions generally got paid in the market moved together, but there's a growing discrepancy in linebacker contracts. And we've talked a lot about that on the podcast here, how maybe linebacker is the most difficult position in the NFL right now. I was going to ask that to Bobby if we ever got him on the show. I don't know if Chris asked him, but if Bobby ever shows up, we'll ask him that question. How difficult is it to play linebacker now? And, traditionally linebacker is seen as a devalued position, but is it more valuable than ever given how much they're attacked in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct says it's become a little bit of both. So linebacker generally, I think, is becoming a little bit devalued. And this idea of, you grab those guys in the first round, they'll make an impact to your defense and transform things. I don't know if that's true anymore. And I think more and more linebackers coming into the NFL are struggling earlier in their career until you eventually see, what they're capable of. Look at a guy like Roquan Smith, right? Roquan Smith was one of the best coverage prospects we've seen come into the NFL. This perfect linebacker for the modern day NFL coming out of Georgia. And, you take Roquan Smith high in the draft. We're in year 3, year 4 now for Roquan. And we've only just started to see him show up as the kind of the NFL player that his college tape said he was going to be. So it's taken a while for a guy even as talented as him to make that kind of positive impact on a defense that you need at that position. So generally, I think that level of play, all linebackers are getting lit up almost throughout the NFL. So if you're drafting one of those guys in the top 10 and they're not making that much of an impact versus whatever other linebacker you had in that spot, otherwise, it's not giving you a great return on your investment. On the other hand, if you do hit on one of the few guys that are capable of still moving the needle, whether it's Bobby Wagner, whether it's Fred Warner, whether it's Eric Kendricks, if you get one of those guys, like they are still materially changing how an offense attacks you. They are actually affecting games. And, Kendricks is a great example. You can point to specific games, that 49ers game, which they ultimately went on to win quite handily. But for the first half, Eric Kendricks was affecting that game and, causing Jimmy Garoppolo all kinds of problems. And he's done that in multiple games for the Vikings. Fred Warner did it in multiple games last season for the 49ers. If you get one of those guys that's able to play with his head above water in today's NFL, those are still, I think, very valuable. But the position across the board, I think, is becoming devalued.
Yeah, so just for some perspective on where Fred Warner is. Last year, he played over 970 snaps. Run defense, overall defense grade, 88.6. Coverage grade was over 90, though. And I think that's the key here in today's NFL. His athleticism, his functional athleticism, right? I mean, when you talk about athleticism, it's not just 40 time. It's not just straight line speed. It's how does that show up on the field? Fred Warner is fantastic at getting range. We always talk a lot about how linebacker range is crucial. Their ability to get depth and avoid giving up big passes behind them, but also, closing quickly on the stuff underneath them. Just passer rating's not a great stat for linebacker, but it's one of those things when it's really good, it probably tells a story. That was Luke Kuechly throughout much of his career. The grade probably told a better story, but Fred Warner has done a fantastic job from a passer rating against standpoint, limiting big plays at linebacker, where those guys are generally attacked a ton. Run defense grade was okay, and he could do some damage as a blitzer. And I think that's the key for these linebackers, right? Warner last year, by our wins above replacement metric, number 4 in the NFL, 4th most valuable linebacker in the NFL last year, but he's trending in the right direction. He's still young. It is a position where I think, like a Roquan Smith, maybe it does take time, but this might be the time to lock up a Fred Warner. The other argument I'm going to make is the general analytics community tends to say, no, get your corners, right? Cornerback is the place where Coverage is the most important thing in the NFL as far as defense goes. It's more important than pass rush. You got to have good corners. You can't have a weak link in your cornerback room, essentially. But the argument I would make for Fred Warner is the scheme. In the situation, that does matter. I'll pull some numbers out on this in a minute. But zone-heavy schemes do matter more for linebackers. And a lot of our numbers have shown, even though we always talk about zone coverage for cornerbacks, being a skill set, that it's not the same as playing man, it is more difficult to play man overall in the NFL. Those guys do get torched far more often when you're playing man. But in zone, the linebackers in a zone-heavy system, cover 2, cover 3, quarters where you do have one-on-one matchups a lot, the linebackers do have a lot of pressure on them. We talk about it with the Steelers a lot. Those guys get attacked, and if you have a weakness, they get attacked even more. But if you have a strength at linebacker like a Fred Warner, it is an asset. So I don't think the contract is as egregious as maybe the nerds would suggest, Sam.
Yeah, and it's also, it's working out as like a 3-year deal with some big money, which isn't horrendous, even if the whole thing goes south. I mean, the first point I think is that, look, Fred Warner's stock is never going to be higher than it is coming off last year, because right now, if you look at his career, it's that perfect developmental snapshot, right? It's, intriguing prospect, talented guy, gets better, and then boom, year 3, breakout, best linebacker in the NFL. Now's when you cash in. Now we get this guy locked in for the next, X number of years, and we have the cornerstone of our defense. But as we know, it doesn't always work like that. And just because a guy had a career year in a contract year, or a career year, that led to this big contract, it doesn't necessarily mean he won't regress next year. And when you start writing up the best young linebackers in the NFL, they're full of guys that did that had this great year and then went south, right? Deion Jones is still only 26. We're now, 2017 was his sort of Fred Warner year, if you want to phrase it like that. And then he went backwards. It's not like he became bad, but he didn't maintain that 90 coverage grade year on year on year, because it's really hard to do. Darius Leonard, enemy of the show, friend of the show. Same thing, right? His rookie year, I think, was his best year, and he's kind of not maintained that level year on year. He's been good, but not great since that. So Fred Warner played amazingly last year, was as good as it gets in the NFL. If you were a betting man, I would put my money on him playing significantly worse than that in 2021, not better, or not even at the same level. So from his perspective, like, you're never going to get a better opportunity of making the big money than right now. For the 49ers, none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. So, even if you played man coverage all the time, which nobody does anymore, you need a linebacker that can cover, right? You need a guy that can go one-on-one with Christian McCaffrey or whoever it's going to be out of the backfield. That's a desirable skill set. If you play more zone than man, which basically every team in the NFL does, in this scheme in particular, this sort of Seattle tree of cover 3, that is a nightmare for linebackers. Like, you need linebackers that have a huge amount of range, that understand zone concepts and zone beaters, and can get to the right spot to close these windows. Fred Warner can definitely do that. But also, with the exception of the Arizona Cardinals, pretty much every team in the NFL is really good at moving receivers to specific spots to get favorable matchups. So you think of a linebacker patrolling the middle of the field, only having to really deal with tight ends and running backs and the occasional slot receiver who's not that, big a problem. Those guys have to cover, AJ Brown and Julio Jones and, Justin Jefferson and Mike
Tyreek Hill,
and whichever elite number 1 receiver a team decides they can get a good matchup by moving into the slot and running him over the middle and into the linebacker's coverage areas. So you can't just say, like, this guy covers the middle of the field and that's not that difficult a thing to do, and he's only doing it against like lesser weapons within the offense. That guy is going to have to cover elite number 1 wide receivers. And when it goes wrong, it's when you get people pulling up the tape and going, oh, any defense that has Julio Jones covered by a linebacker is just a bad play call. It isn't always. And if you have a guy capable of doing that and surviving, not going one-on-one, down the field on a post route, whatever, but just surviving and shutting out the window, right? And making the quarterback go to read number 2, That is a very, very valuable skill. And it's what Luke Kuechly was so amazing at for a whole, like a decade. And Fred Warner, at least on last year's evidence, is very, very good at that. And that is worth a lot of money.
I want to get into some of the numbers that I found, or at least some of the rankings that I found that might put into perspective just the role that a Fred Warner or Bobby Wagner or Darius Leonard has to execute. But before we do that, quick shout out to our friends over at Fantrax. Fantrax's NFL Fantasy Football League Manager is the most customizable, easy to use, and feature-rich platform in the entire industry. PFF is gearing up to play our leagues on Fantrax this season. They've got multi-team trades, player salary, contract options, bonus points for touchdowns of different yardage, projected player rankings based on your league's custom scoring, and then auto-generate player salaries for your own league. So whichever league you're in, you just customize it any way you want. This is what makes Fantrax so great. If you're coming from another site, that's no problem as well. They import any of your current leagues. So you can sign up and play now at fantrax.com/PFF and actually get a chance to win an autographed jersey from our favorite player, Buffalo Bills quarterback, Josh Allen. This is fantrax.com/PFF, home of fantasy sports. All right, Sam, I'm not on our R&D research and development team, but I could do some basic math. I could do some simple stuff. And this comes from a couple questions that we've had, okay? Why a lot of people have asked us through the years, why do we not adjust grades for situation or for supporting cast or whatever it may be? And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. One of those reasons, though, is we definitely don't necessarily want grades to change throughout the season, right? Like, so if we say a guy's a 90 in week 1, and then we get new information that the team he had a 90 against is actually terrible because of something that happened weeks 2, 3, and 4, we don't want that 90 to go down to like an 85. So we don't want grades moving retroactively is one of the reasons. The other reason is I think we can unlock context later and almost separate the two things. Like, here's how well this guy produced, and then here's what this guy was asked to do. And we could separate those two things. So, long story short, looking through the PFF database and the history, as I mentioned earlier, playing zone for a linebacker is a difficult task. They get attacked by route concepts, and they grade a little bit lower than they do in man coverage. The other reason for that is a lot of times in man coverage, linebackers are almost like, a lot of times they're the extra player. They're like what we call a hole player or an extra player where they don't necessarily have specific responsibility. They're not always in man coverage, so to speak. They can kind of freelance and read the quarterback and kind of make it's almost like a free play for them, where they can make a play on the ball and get credit for it. Whereas if they don't, hey, it's okay. They weren't they were freelancing and they didn't necessarily have responsibility to cover somebody directly. But in zone coverage, again, you do have to worry about the dig route behind 20 yards behind you, but also the route in front of you and being able to play both and split the difference and know where the quarterback's going. So all that said, I did some basic adjustments over the last 3 years and said, okay, which linebackers on a per snap basis played the specific coverages that were most difficult? And for linebackers, it's cover 2, it's cover 3, it's those zone heavy deals. So roughly some of the linebackers that have had the most difficult assignments over the last couple of years. Bobby Wagner's in the top 8 or 10, depending on how many snaps you want to assign to this data set. So Bobby Wagner's there. And then Fred Warner's there. Fred Warner's in the top 15 most difficult. So the 49ers linebackers are high. And you see a lot of this by team. So again, most teams are going to play. The zone-heavy teams will have a lot of linebackers high on this list. So there's a lot of Chargers linebackers, Seahawks linebackers, 49ers. So a lot of teams that play that cover 3 basic system. So Fred Warner having one of the more difficult tasks in the NFL, plus executing really well last year in particular and showing the ability to play this scheme really well. Again, I think it's just another feather in his cap, and I think it's another way to look at this and say, PFF grade tells you what a guy did in the situation he was asked, but we can go back and parse out the situation and then say, how easy, how difficult was this? And I did this for corners as well, and we could talk about maybe some of those guys if you want as well. But I think with Warner, it's just timely saying, look, he's performed really well in a difficult role with the 49ers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of the guys that are using the analytics numbers and saying, look, you shouldn't throw big money towards a linebacker. I think generally that's probably a pretty decent rule of thumb. And this is different to running backs where you say, well, look, you get yourself into trouble where you start chasing unicorns and saying, this is the exception. This guy is different, so we should throw the money at him. And that's how you end up with a Christian McCaffrey contract. And as special as Christian McCaffrey is, when he went out of the lineup, Carolina's EPA per play was better, right? They were a more efficient, more productive offense when Christian McCaffrey was injured versus when he was in the lineup. That isn't because Christian McCaffrey is a bad player. It's because of everything we know about running backs in terms of they are products of the environment around them far more than they are a product of being better than the running back 2 on the depth chart. I think linebacker is slightly different than that in that you're not chasing unicorns. You're simply saying that, look, there's 5 guys in the NFL that can actually move the needle versus everybody else at what they do, which is different to what it used to be in the past, where there might be 20 of those guys that were giving you high-end play. In fact, more when you consider how many starting linebackers there were. But right now, I think you're dealing with an extremely low number of people. But that low number, those guys are worth giving money to. So Fred Warner, if he maintains that level. Eric Kendricks, I think, is definitely one of them. Roquan Smith, I think, will be one of them if he continues to show the kind of coverage skills he had last year. Levante David is still playing at that kind of level, even though people are focusing on Devin White within the Bucs defense. Those guys, I think, are still worth handing a decent chunk of change to. Now, you can debate how much the cash should be, but the market sets that. But ultimately, it becomes like a binary decision, right? You're not going to have that much to say in terms of, do you give him 19 million a year or like 12? That's just not a discussion that's being had because the market is going to dictate what that figure is. So your question is simply, does Fred Warner get this contract or do you bail? Do you cut bait, move on, and get somebody else? And I think if those are your two decisions, even if numbers say, linebacker generally is being devalued and it's a skill you might want to dedicate resources elsewhere, I think too much favors the yes. So you sign him. You sign Fred Warner and hope that the regression back from what we saw last year isn't too hard and that all the other positive things still hold.
Yeah. So again, one other thing to consider here is I think the width of linebacker performance is getting it's getting wider, right? I mean, going back to it's a difficult position. I think there are just more worse seasons. There are more bad seasons by linebackers. So the how much it hurts you now to have a bad linebacker is affecting you more maybe than it used to. The other point, the point I think you make about running back versus linebacker is a good one, right? I actually had this discussion with Eric Eager, the guy who built wins above replacement, and we were talking about the Warner contract yesterday, and he said, "Well, you're choosing that defensive scheme, right? You're choosing that scheme that you're saying is more difficult on linebackers." Yes, just like if you decide I'm going to run the ball a lot, you're choosing that. But the difference there is there's a lot of evidence that shows running the ball too much is less effective for your offense, right? So it is your fault if you choose to run a lot and then have to make personnel decisions based off of that. That is actually your fault, so to speak. Whereas defensively, there isn't actually a better strategy man versus zone. It's actually not like there's nothing that says, "Hey, you idiots, stop playing so much zone coverage. That's bad for your defense." There are good zone teams. There are good man teams. There are bad zone, bad man teams. So it's when you choose a defensive system, I do think you have to have consideration, and I'm opening my mind to this. You have to have more consideration for what your system's asking guys to do. We've known this intuitively, but again, in simple terms, in a zone-heavy system, the linebacker means more. In a man-heavy system, the cornerback means even more than we think that they already do, because you need 3 of them. You need 4 of them. And cornerback's valuable everywhere, but again, Fred Warner's value for the 49ers, for what they do, is higher than if the Patriots signed him with all the man they play, or the Dolphins, or some of these other teams.
There's also a big difference between changing your defensive scheme or changing any scheme to fit a certain player that you already have, right, versus changing a scheme so that you don't need that player. Like that's a very different equation that you're asking somebody to run. It's one thing to say we need to adjust what we're doing from our traditional the scheme, the system that we run, because we have this player who's special and he can take advantage of different things if we adjust the scheme a little bit, versus, well, let's change this scheme completely so that we don't have to pay this guy, because then we can, like, that doesn't, that's a much harder sell to me, is to say you have a system, you don't have a player that fits that system perfectly, and because it gets to the stage where you need to hand him a contract, you want to change everything so that you no longer require that guy. That's just a harder argument to make in my eyes.
Do you think that the Jamal Adams deal has elements of that, right? The Seattle Seahawks traded for Jamal Adams and did change their defense. They changed what they did to accommodate his skill set, and it did not work for the majority of the season. They got a little bit better down the stretch as they played worse offenses, but I think that was a risky proposition for the Seahawks, bringing Jamal Adams in. Now, in hindsight, seeing what they did, bringing him in essentially as an edge rushing safety, and, inventing a new position for him. We'll have to ask Bobby, at some point, how much, that's another question I wanted to ask him. How much did the defense change last year? And was it because of personnel? Was it because of having a Jamal Adams? Was it because of maybe the pass rush just wasn't there? And that's the one thing I will say to just wrap up this conversation. Have mentioned this before, but the quote unquote cover 3 system that Seattle started running, early last decade and has taken over throughout the NFL, is it a more fragile system? Is it one of those deals where you kind of need everything for it to work well? In other words, you need a true free safety. You need a great Cam Chancellor-esque strong safety. It would be great to have at least one great corner like a Richard Sherman. You need a middle linebacker like a Bobby Wagner or now a Fred Warner who could do all the things you ask of him. But just as importantly, you need a 4-man rush. You need a pass rush that can get there. Whereas the thing that our data has pointed to, which is the idea of build your team back to front, get as deep as you can at corner, and then, kind of create pressure through blitzes and phantom blitzes and all that stuff. You don't need as good of a personnel. You don't need your personnel to be as good to run that style. You just need to be really strong in the secondary, and you just have maybe a higher margin of error. I think that might be one thing to consider when it comes to choosing your defensive scheme and how you're going to attack offenses, that maybe needing to be strong at all 3 levels is perhaps one of the weaknesses of the Seattle cover 3 system.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are problems with that system generally. It hasn't gone the way of the Tampa 2 yet, which is nobody can run that essentially as a base defense, and that's the thing that you run and almost nothing else the way you could 15 years ago. But it's heading in that direction. Like, even the defense as it currently stands has to be heavily modified from what Seattle were doing right at the start, which was not that complicated and didn't have that many wrinkles to it. The system is changing and evolving, as everything needs to do at the NFL level, but you still need certain keystone players in order to have any shot of making it functional. And I think Fred Warner is one of those guys.
Also, I want to be clear, when I have put the Niners into this cover 3 bucket, they do not play it as much as a lot of the previous Pete Carroll tree has, right? They have evolved, played a lot of quarters, and they've added wrinkles to it, but the basic idea is they still don't play a ton of man coverage. Right. They still do put a lot on they do put a lot to the linebackers and what they're asked to do. So want to tell you guys also about, where am I going here? Where is it? Where'd it go? Underdog Fantasy. If you like fantasy football,
my transition
that was terrible.
Was pretty smooth when I was doing this. Are you coming in screwing it up?
I misclicked. How's this one? Linebackers don't do much for your fantasy football team, but if you do like fantasy football and if you like fantasy for money, playing fantasy for money, you need to check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog's got everything, including season-long and playoff best ball. Best ball is a season-long game where you draft a team like you normally do, but that's it. No in-season roster management. Underdog automatically selects your best performers each week, saving you loads of time. So go to Underdog Fantasy, deposit $10. That's it. Use the promo code PFF, and you get a free PFF Edge annual subscription. That's promo code PFF. Draft now at Underdog Fantasy. So there are many great ways to get your PFF subscriptions. You can go through Underdog Fantasy, $10, use the promo code. You can go to PFF.com if you're a first-timer, 40% off using SAVE40. All right, you just sent me. You want to talk about the? You want to talk about Whale?
Yeah, but just quickly, I don't think anything is set in stone yet, but there is potentially a favorite.
Bobby Wagner interview?
Oh, that's potentially on the horizon as well. There's also potentially a favorite, a sponsor, an ad read of the podcast on its way back, which will make spectacular transitions and leads in to segues into the ad read. I'm excited for those.
There have been rumblings. Yes, rumblings that that one of the favorite sponsors is on its way back.
Favorite. I mean, let's tell it like it is. It is the favorite PFF podcast sponsor that is hopefully returning and will lead to some spectacular ads.
Clearly, because we sold so much product
Hell yeah.
when pushing this particular sponsor that they wanted back in. Balls to the wall, they're going
them.
to, yeah, balls to the wall, coming back.
Jingle balls to the wall.
Now you're giving it away. Now you're just giving it away.
It could be anybody. Anybody could have had that line in their ad read. Who knows?
I hope our new HR department isn't actually listening to our podcast. Where's the line here? Do they have to approve these ad reads?
This feels like the kind of thing where, once you'll get the notice, you know what I mean? If they're listening, there'll be a little like note in your email one day. Just, hey, you stop by HR?
Yeah, hopefully just a little slap on the wrist, a little warning.
Yeah. First time offense, yeah.
Send me a link for the Whale stuff. That's on the site.
No, but it was in that presentation that they did today.
It was. Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can get some information. You talk about it. Go ahead.
Well, our R&D interns created this metric that essentially was adjusting injuries and how that affected teams last year. And I just thought it was an interesting nugget in terms of which teams essentially got lucky and which teams really didn't. And it's very intuitive, particularly the ones that got hurt badly with the injuries. It's the teams you would expect, right? Obviously, Dallas lost their quarterback while they were cooking and had a bunch of other injuries, and that hurt them pretty badly. And the 49ers were like the most injury-ravaged team in the NFL. That wrecked their season as well. But I'm actually more interested in the teams at the other end of the scale, the ones that dodge the bullet, so to speak, when it comes to injuries. And it went both ways. So Miami is a team I think that I've talked about quite a bit in terms of one that's heading in the right direction, that were probably ahead of the curve in terms of where they thought they would be last year. And one of the big things pushing that is probably because they didn't lose anybody to injury, right? They accelerated this development curve and the growth of the team and how good they were expected to be because nobody got hurt. So when you're a healthy team, you can be better than everybody expects you to be. The Vikings, though, were another team that were actually fairly healthy once they got into the season and didn't help them at all. And then the Texans are another one who were actually remarkably injury-free and yet terrible last year. So, but the Dolphins and the Bills as well were quite a healthy team who rode that wave of injury luck to a lot of success last year, which if you're sort of predicting how well those teams will do this season and adjusting for a little bit more bad luck on the injury front would be concerning. Suddenly you think, well, what happens if they regress back to the mean, a couple of guys get injured during the course of the season, Buffalo and Miami's seasons start to look a little bit less rosy.
So I want to ask you this from the lens of what can teams do with this? I think this is good information for bettors. I think it's really good information for Vegas setting lines, right? I mean, it's easy to look at the Dolphins and say, okay, there's no way they can be this healthy next year, right? That has to regress. That tends to regress a little bit. And if you look at all the numbers where teams excel that are just tough to replicate, you do get a feel for the teams that overachieved or underachieved. And that's why a lot of times, season projections or whatever it is just don't match perception, because the perception of the Dolphins are exactly what you said. On their way up and rosters getting better. Yeah, there's a quarterback question, but like everything else is looking pretty good. But if they just have an unhealthy season compared to last year, are they instantly, if they were unhealthy last year or middle of the pack last year, are they a 500 team instead of a team that's, pretty much right on the playoff cusp.
Yeah, I mean, I think if they had an averagely unhealthy season last year, they are probably where people expected them to be going into the year, right? Which is they're going to be better. They're moving in the right direction, but they're not going to be good. They're not going to be a playoff threatening side, a team that could have made it. They're going to be in the ascendancy. And I think last year, it accelerated things, which is why they were benching Tua for Ryan Fitzpatrick, because all of a sudden they were in the playoff hunt because they were relatively or very injury free. So it's just an interesting way of looking at, where these teams are headed and how much injuries affected that.
All right, I'm going to ask you a high level question here. I want to call this section, what can NFL coaches do to actually win more games? All right, so I'm going to pivot off of the injury stuff. So our friend Mike Tannenbaum, friend of the show, he's been on the show a couple months back. He has his own little NFL think tank called 33rd Team. They do some weekly calls. I'm on there generally, and it's a really good mix of former NFL personnel and our friend GMAT. Sam is always there. GMAT's there as well. But I mean, you've got a slew of former GMs and former coaches and young kids trying to get into the business. It's really a great football discussion. Jim Bob Cooter was on there breaking down Matthew Stafford. It was a good little breakdown because he coached Matthew Stafford and actually cited Matthew Stafford's turnover-worthy plays per PFF versus Jared Goff's and how Stafford might take care of the ball a little bit better than Goff. So it's a good discussion. There hit a point in the discussion this week, however, where they were just looking at things that correlate, or at least things that correlate to winning, so to speak. I'm going to put that in air quotes, correlate. Turnover rate and how many points you score and all these things. And, obviously teams that score more than 30 points, they win more games, right? So you had all these things on a list and you could just kind of see the differences in what led to winning more games. And I think the question what a lot of the coaches did on the call was say, yeah, we always preach taking care of the ball, right? We always preach getting the ball and turning it over. Of course, that's a big part of winning. And then I kind of posed the question, yeah, but have you figured out how to coach that, right? Have you done that consistently? And I'll ask the same thing about injuries, right? Are there teams that can actually avoid injury? Do we have enough information about injuries now that you can build your training staff and your training protocols and all these things to avoid injuries better than other teams? I don't know if teams are actually, I don't know if that's a skill teams have achieved yet. So I'm kind of open-ended here because there was a lot of coaches on this call who were intrigued, like, yeah, man, I just want to never turn the ball over. I'll win 75% of my games, but I think they're still kind of missing the boat because you can't really control that. If you could, I mean, you'd be winning 14 games a year.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I don't think there's an awful lot you can do. I know there isn't an awful lot of stability year to year in terms of that injury data. There aren't many teams. It's not predictive, right? Knowing that a team was bad one year in terms of injuries, it's not likely to stick the following year and the year after that. Obviously, there are teams that have had really bad injury luck and teams that have had really good injury luck for a period of time. But the overall breadth of the data says that this is not like a predictive thing. In terms of how you can actually address that, I don't know where the NFL is right now in terms of the use of not just player tracking data for sort of NGS and all that kind of stuff, but for injury specifically. I know, rugby is pushing this a lot now, and the Lions, Steve, the Lions are about to play South Africa this week, the first test, and they are apparently, it'll be the first time they use this real-time player tracking data to the point where, it shows workload and all these kinds of things that can start to give you an indication of when a soft tissue injury is going to occur and that kind of thing.
Right.
Or there was like a 2-day lag on this stuff. Once they collected all the data and put it all together and reanalyzed it, and then you could be like, oh, in the 60th minute, this guy probably should have come off the field because he was done. This will be the first time that they can see that live and be number 15 there, he's done. He's out of this. We need to get him off the field before he pulls a hamstring or whatever it is. I don't know where the NFL is on that. I know I don't think they're allowed to use that kind of stuff in games, but for practice and training camp and that kind of stuff, that's a potential area where you can start to get ahead of this stuff. I don't know, again, how much that stops, because a lot of the injuries are not soft tissue, it's not muscle strains. It's like, how do you stop tearing an ACL, or how do you stop Cam Akers popping his Achilles? And I suspect those are just complete unknowns. That's the luck of the draw. That's just the roll of the dice. I don't know that you're going to fix that, but there are definitely sports science areas that are pushing now being able to prevent those soft tissue injuries, which are important. Like a guy going down with a hamstring injury that keeps him out 4 weeks, that's vital. Like if Julio Jones is missing for 4 weeks because of a hamstring injury you could have seen coming in the data, that's an edge. That's an edge that you can gain versus another team that doesn't see that happening.
Yeah, so going back to PFF.com and in the article that was written by Tage Seth and Ben Brown, really great job by them. So you mentioned the teams in particular that, teams like the Dolphins who benefited from being healthy, the teams who got crushed by not being healthy, and not healthy in the right areas, right? Dallas and San Francisco, they're low in this WAR-adjusted injuries lost number, because they lost their quarterbacks. They lost Jimmy Garoppolo. They lost Dak Prescott. But the next section says, well, there's no stability year to year for injuries, right? So there is nothing that says, hey, we figured this out, right? So that's where, if you're the Dolphins, so the teams that were best at avoiding injuries last year, Dolphins, Bills, Packers. You mentioned the Vikings, Texans were actually really good at avoiding injuries, but not, saving wins, so to speak. If they decide, hey, we figured this out, we're good at avoiding injuries, that's not really the case.
Well,
so I don't know how actionable that is for teams.
You were sort of asking, what can you do with this information? And on the surface, nothing. Like, it isn't predictive. It doesn't. But what I think it can do is serve as a pretty useful check or big picture lens for an organization, right? So the Dolphins are a great example. The Dolphins could easily be drawn into thinking, well, we are really close right now. We can roll into 2021 based off being better last year than we thought we were going to be. We're essentially a step or two further down the line in our great project to win a Super Bowl and bring another championship to Miami. But if you use this data, you look at this and you say, well, okay, you look like you were a step further on last year, but maybe you're not. Like, maybe you're actually where you thought you would be, but because of this injury luck you managed to have last season, you looked better than you actually were. And if you adjust for that this year, you're probably exactly where you thought you were going to be, and that should inform the decisions you're making this offseason. So instead of thinking you're further on down this project, which changes some of the personnel decisions you might make, actually, you're basically exactly where you thought you were. So I think the actionable information from this kind of data is that it's the big picture lens to just make you think twice about exactly where you are based off what happened last season.
I think that's the best point, right? I think that's a great point. It's similar to what we've talked about before, like where a lot of coaches come into the offseason, they're like, man, we're just got to get better on third and short. We were 2 for 12 on third and short, and if we just get better at that, we'll win 4 more games. And you end up losing maybe the macro view, the high-level view of where your team is. And I do think front office decisions and coaching decisions, you need to know where your baseline is. It would be, to your point, it would be fool's gold to say, hey, we're a 12-win team because we won 12 games last year, just using a hypothetical team here. We won 12 games last year, even if there are other indicators that say, actually, you're more of like a 9-win team. You had a little bit of luck. The turnovers fell your way. The injuries fell your way. Your fourth down success was incredible. Your third down success was incredible. The Carson Wentz season that we always reference in 2017. It would be fool's gold to look at things that are unstable from year to year and assume they're going to remain stable or remain favorable going forward. So then decisions might be made in too short-sighted of a manner, thinking, hey, we're close, when truly you do need to make macro decisions. I would look at the Bears of 2018 as that thing, right? We won all these games, and Mitchell Trubisky was our quarterback, so therefore he must have been a good quarterback leading this first-place team when they easily could, or the 2017 Jaguars, 1 game away from the Super Bowl. They could properly assess their team and say, we won all these games despite our quarterback. Let's actually try to upgrade it. It'd It'd be a power move. It was the thing that the Ravens did after they won the Super Bowl that Trent Dilfer's still upset about. They looked at, instead of saying, Trent's our guy because we won a Super Bowl with him, they said, actually, we think we can upgrade, and they tried to make a move. I think it was Elvis Gerback, right, that came in after him. Whether it worked or not, it doesn't matter. That was the thought process, and I think that's the right thought process, which is thinking of the team from a high-level view, not like, hey, we had 12 wins, therefore a couple good moves and we'll win 13 or 14 going forward.
Right.
All right, so that's good stuff. Anyway, it was interesting to me that being on a phone call with a whole bunch of former coaches and former GMs, I do think they're still getting into this causation correlation type of deal, right? Get your running back 20 carries. Get your, don't just never turn the ball over on offense. Obviously, there are some things that you can't. The other one is the team that scores first wins like 60% of the time. Well, that's generally explained because good teams probably score first. I mean, that's it. The better team generally scores first. It's not because it's a tactical advantage that is that strong. It's probably like a percentage point or two. But, the Chiefs probably score first more because they're a better team and they have Patrick Mahomes and a good offense.
Yeah. So somebody emailed us a while ago who was some kind of psychologist or a behavioral scientist or something like that. And he kind of listed out a lot of the common, methods of thinking and all this kind of stuff that affect everything, right? And the NFL, I think, is huge in this. They're very bad at understanding biases. So teams that, exactly what you said, when they look at their season previously and they say, where did it go right? Where did it go wrong? What can we fix next year and move on? They tend to think that all the things that went right will stay the same, and they just need to fix the things that went wrong. And they're very bad at sort of understanding the biases at play when they do that self-evaluation, I think, generally. And there are teams that are very good at it, and those typically are the teams that win year on year and are able to avoid going down those mistakes. But like one of my favorites is that idea that it's survivorship bias, right? The things that went right will continue to go right. The story, the best example of that survivorship bias, the World War II planes thing. You know about that?
No, what's that now? By the way, I found the email. We can actually go through this email if you want to. It's a good discussion.
Okay. I mean, I don't know that we necessarily need to go through the whole thing because there's a lot there that I don't really understand and don't intend to research in the next 8 seconds. But so they were evaluating or analyzing all these planes that made it back in World War II and like where the bullet holes were on them and therefore where they needed to sort of reinforce with extra armor and make things more efficient and those kinds of things. So they were looking at all these bullet holes and plotted them kind of on a plane and found out that they're all on the wings, they're on the tail, they're on the fuselage, but they're not on the engines, right? So they were saying, well, okay, what we need to do is to reinforce these areas. Like let's put armor on the wings, let's put armor on the fuselage because that's where these planes are getting hit, and that's the issue. But the point is that all the ones where the bullet holes were in the engine are at the bottom of the sea somewhere. Right. They didn't make it back, right? But actually there was a very smart guy who recognized this and was arguing the exact opposite, that actually what you want is to reinforce the areas that you're not finding bullet holes, because those are the planes that never made it back. So while you look at this data and the data says that's the area you should reinforce, the wings, these are the areas you should attack, the smart people recognize the fallacy and the problem that, look, this is a bias in the data. This is survivorship bias. And what you actually want to do is do the exact opposite of what this data set is telling you. That, I think, is what a lot of NFL teams are bad at recognizing year on year is, hey, this says we're great at surviving injuries. Therefore, we can avoid building depth in specific areas, or we can just ride what's happening so far. But the data would actually say, do the opposite, reinforce the areas where you just got away with it, because that's probably not happening 2 years in a row.
I mean, even just the football analogy of like, take care of the engine, man. Take care of your engine, and you don't have to worry about things on the edges.
Which is not running back, by the way, as a like.
No. The engine's still the pass game on both sides of the ball, and then make sure that the other stuff is good enough. Emails from Michael Allen. I'll highlight a couple points. It came back a few weeks back. He's a clinical social worker in Massachusetts. He talked a lot about psychology and just again, cognitive distortions or things that your mind plays tricks on you. So one of the ones he highlighted was overgeneralization, which means extrapolating a general rule from a singular event. And the example he used, one that we've used, is the Chiefs. They got a bad roll of the dice with their offensive line last year, overgeneralized that experience heading into the season. So they very unluckily lost their starting left tackle, and their right tackle never came back, and everybody got hurt on the offensive line. The Super Bowl happened, and they got crushed. But then they overinvested, passing up opportunities. This is Michael writing here, Michael Allen. They overinvested, passing up on opportunities to make higher EV plays by adding weapons for Mahomes. Wouldn't Will Fuller, the great Alejandro Villanueva, and some cap room to sign a guard be better for the team maybe than, say, a Joe Thuney? And legitimately, Will Fuller plus Alejandro Villanueva will make about as much as Joe Thuney this year. And it is a great point. Now, it's not always as simple as, hey, just go make those moves, but let's envision that for a second.
Right.
Alejandro Villanueva is the starting left tackle. Maybe they still have a first-round pick. All those other picks, they still have a first-round pick that they didn't use on Orlando Brown. And then they have Will Fuller. Imagine Will Fuller on that Kansas City Chiefs team that already has Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, and he becomes your third option. We've already talked how much Will Fuller actually improves the offenses that he is on historically. What would he do for the Chiefs? Far more than the Le'Veon Bell signing a couple years ago, and probably far more than the offensive line investment. So yeah, it's a great example. Some of the other stuff that he's come up with, this one, catastrophizing, Sam. A common issue. That's assuming the worst when faced with the unknown. When people catastrophize, ordinary worries can quickly escalate. How about that on like fourth down decisions for an NFL coach? They immediately think, what's going to happen if I don't get it? And they don't necessarily see the positive side maybe of those decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a huge one, particularly with this stuff that has traditionally been the opposite of the way you do it. So fourth down decisions is a great example. Everybody realizes that the data says you should be going for it more in fourth down, and you should be the 2-point conversion is another one, right? Where you should be going for it earlier, but that's not the way it used to be done. It's not the way it's always been done. So it's and the reason for that is essentially guys were too conservative. Coaches and decision makers were too conservative because they're envisaging the worst, right? This is not the way it's done. So if I start doing it this way and it goes south, then I look like an idiot and I get fired and the whole thing unravels around me. Whereas the data is saying you should be doing this more and finding out where the other end is, right? Finding out where it stops to become an edge and where you stop making positive gains on it. By just framing it differently. Instead of imagining what the worst is, start imagining what the best is. Like how much good can we do by pushing this boundary instead of like how bad can it get if I screw it up?
There's one of the other that Michael lists here is called discounting the positive. There's overlap. That's kind of the same thing that we're talking about there. Discounting the positive outcome of those fourth down decisions. I want to talk about two more of them, though, I think are interesting. One is emotional reasoning, the false belief that your emotions are truth, that the way you feel about a situation is a reliable indicator of reality. Oh man, this could go far beyond football, but from a football sense right now, the emotional reasoning aspect, there are so many football truths that people believe, their truth, whatever it is, establishing the run or whatever it might be, that I do. I think. What's that?
That's also a fourth down one. It's the reason that always gets thrown at you is, hey, the analytics can't tell you if your left guard's getting beat up and the right guard's tired, and all these emotional things that are real. They exist, and leaving aside for the moment that analytics actually can tell you most of that. That's the thing, right? It's your emotional response to this is probably not as valuable as the overall weight of the data that's telling you the result, the chance of this actually working is a more important thing than how you feel that the right guard is performing in this particular instance.
The one that I've run into a lot, I've talked to a lot of evaluators who they just always remember their games. They remember the games where they lost. I've heard somebody say, I remember the game where our defensive end just got crushed in the run game, and I'll never have a bad run run stuffing defensive end again, right? I'll never have somebody who's bad against the run. And it's it's emotional overreaction to your situation, which is a very, human thing to do. It's like I like, your life is a small sample size, unfortunately. Your life experiences are a small sample size, and it's a tough thing to remember that your particular losses or wins even, right? A lot of people look back and say, we won this way, therefore it must be the way to do it, when maybe it isn't necessarily, or it was an outlier.
It's also not necessarily even accurate. I mean, memory lies to you all the time. Memory isn't the accurate indicator of anything. B, and I know from doing the data collection on this stuff and from grading guys that you're not necessarily remembering it accurately, even when you're, paying attention and doing it in an in-depth way and going play by play, grading a specific guy. Like, just the difference between your recollection of doing that and the actual number at the end of it all, right? So even just simplify it down to plus or minus, or nothing. If you do that for every single guy for 60 plays and then compare what you think that is intuitively, like what the final number is versus what it actually is, you're probably way off. Like, you're not going to remember that accurately. So, and a guy watching the game on the sideline, essentially, whilst play calling and doing other things, is even worse in terms of like what his recollection is. So the guy whose feeling is that the left guard is getting his ass kicked and therefore can't block for this 4th down attempt you want to run is probably remembering like 2 plays where he got owned, right? Versus the other 50 in the game where nothing has happened, right? So even,
but there's something else to that, though.
Measuring this.
So not only can you not necessarily remember the good and the bad for that particular guy, you also can't, off the top of your head, remember what the baseline is. Like, what's the baseline expectation for that particular player? It might be that, guards and centers actually do get beat more often, and that's just, and that is kind of the truth in the run game historically. Therefore, the best, an average center is going to have more losses than wins overall. Or when we get this a lot with our offensive line grades, the left tackle was great except these 5 plays. It's like, well, okay, that's fine, but the average left tackle loses 5 plays a game, right? The average left tackle wins 90% of the time, whatever that 88% of the time, 90% of the time. So it's not like, oh, this guy's great, he won 90%. No, that's average. You have to know what the baseline is as well when you're looking at this stuff.
Right. I mean, I think at the very minimum, like, again, those things are real and they exist, but you need to have an appreciation for how big a piece of the puzzle they should be. And if all the data is overwhelmingly telling you to do one thing, your feeling or your, more untouchable, the kind of the wishy-washy stuff should be at the very minimum, just a little check in the system, right? It's like, how certain is the data that this is the right call? Because I think that this guy is a potential problem there. Like the intangible stuff, right? That shouldn't be the decision. That should be maybe, a check on the actual decision.
All right, the last one here that very, very cool email from Michael Allen. Labeling. So this is reducing oneself or other people to a single, usually negative, characteristic or descriptor like quote-unquote drunk or quote-unquote failure. Do we fall into this, Sam? Do we fall into this as evaluators and just say, this guy's good, this guy's bad, this guy's average?
Sure.
And is that, are there benefits to doing that? Just to get an idea, like if you have more guys that we claim are good, you'll probably be good. Or do you lose some of the nuance when you just label a guy? And maybe this is one of those things that, say, Bill Belichick has been good at through the years. Like Kyle Van Noy would be described as bad historically because of his career with the Lions, but Bill Belichick found what he was good at and put him in a good position to succeed, right? I mean, that's a historically Bill Belichick type of thing to do. So labeling is an interesting one because I think there are some benefits to it, but clearly it's too simplistic at other times as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a common thing in the NFL, whether it's good or bad, whether it's a trait. This guy is clutch, this guy isn't. And again, those are things that are typically transient and don't always stick. Or whether it's just, this guy is very good at this, and then ceases to be, or it was a product of the system, the defense, rather than those kinds of things. Or injuries, I think, are probably another one, right? This guy is injury prone. This guy is durable. And it's just a case of whether he had injury luck or not. There obviously are some guys out there that are injury prone, but there are also guys that just have a couple of injuries and then get healthy and are never injured again. I mean, Frank Gore is one of the best examples of that. That guy tore knee ligaments multiple times in college and slipped to the middle rounds of the draft because he was dubbed injury prone. And then the guy has been like an unbreakable rock in the NFL for 15 years since that. So yeah, I think that's a good example of how labeling could lead you astray.
This guy behind me, is that Fred Taylor? If that is Fred Taylor, it's Fragile Fred until he started to become durable. By like year 3 in his career, all of a sudden he started to play a lot. So yeah, that goes back to our injury question. I know teams, the more I talk to teams, the more I know that they want to know how many games a guy played, how injured was this guy, how many injuries is he, all this stuff. They want to know injury history. And I think an extensive injury history probably leads to some durability issues going forward, but I don't know if they've necessarily cracked the code or found a trend in how to stay healthy, as we've shown previously. So man, it's a good, fun discussion, man. I think a lot of the philosophical offseason stuff is interesting. It's fun, and I like to hear from the fans too, because you guys, like a Michael Allen with his email, you guys fuel a lot of these conversations. So that's great. We love that interaction with the emails. It's nflpodcast@pff.com if you guys want to email us more thoughts and ideas. And then, of course, go to my Twitter bio. I have it in my pinned tweet. You can go to Sam's Twitter page and see where he tweeted it out. But our survey for the millions of you, we're looking for 1 million responses, and just want to hear what you guys think.
Responses.
You don't think we're going to get there?
Well, even if we do, I'm not wading through 1 million replies. There are too many. The
ones that make clean pie charts are fine. It's not so much. It's the ones that are open ended that are tough.
Yeah, at that point, I'm not going through 1 million of them.
Sam promises to read each and every response, and I appreciate those who said they like more baseball stories and anecdotes.
Yeah, I don't.
Because I hear you. I hear your feedback. What, Sam?
I don't appreciate those people. That's all I'm saying.
All right, I think next Thursday we're gonna a week from today we're gonna suit you up into the baseball gear.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Yeah. So I gotta shave that ridiculous facial hair that day. That's gonna suck.
The beard's looking strong. It's looking good.
I had to keep it going because that's going to be the day. It has to be in fine fettle that day.
I'm trying to think what else I need to bring some like sunflower seeds and bubble gum. I think I'm gonna I gotta go all
a packet of Big League Chew.
Big League Chew.
Yeah.
Double bubble was pretty common for us too. The little pieces of double bubble, and every dugout was filled with sunflower seeds, of course. Do you have a preference on sunflower seeds, or are you just like a regular guy?
I don't have a preference for them.
Okay. Because some of like the roasted like barbecue ones and everything were really good.
Seem like a good idea. No.
David sunflower seeds, though, they're the classic salted one. We'll probably bring those in.
Yeah.
So you've got something to chew on during the show.
Perfect.
Tobacco? You're a tobacco guy?
Of course. Well, I think we have that covered with the Big League Chew, right?
Big League Chew, yeah. So you could get the big wad in there. That's good. All right, man. Sounds good. Great show. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Don't forget, save 40% off any PFF subscription over at pff.com if you're a first timer. Special thanks to Fantrax and Underdog Fantasy and our special new sponsor that's coming back, going balls to the wall, coming up very, very soon. All right, buddy. Talk to you on Monday.
All right. Take it easy.
See you guys.